I'm Jan Visser, and I'm the principal editor of a book on seeking understanding. And I'm chatting with Carlo Fabricatore, computer scientist and human factors scholar, right?
That's right.
Working at the University of Huddersfield in the United Kingdom. We'll be talking about the chapter that you contributed to that book that I just mentioned. And I'd like to start it off with a quote that you're not familiar with probably, but there was a Dutch historian and cultural theorist who coined the term Homo ludens, the playing human being. And he suggested that that particular attribute of humans should be added to the already existing designations Homo sapiens and Homo faber. He has written an entire book on the playing human being, considers it an integral part of culture. It's not something that happens within culture, but it's simply part and parcel of it. It says, play goes beyond the confines of purely physical and purely biological activity. There is some sense to it. In play, there is something at play, which transcends the immediate needs of life and imparts meaning to the action. All play means something. Does that make sense to you?
It does. It does. And we're talking about development within the magic circle, which has the potentiality to expand beyond the magic circle.
Mm-hmm.
And it's quite interesting because it makes you wonder about the importance of that magic circle. So whatever happens within that magic circle, the circle of play, how real that is for us, how important it is for us to develop within that magic circle, which is somehow protected by the idea of playfulness, by the idea that we're there to do things together, play together, without having to fulfill any specific need, without having any obligation. Mm-hmm. And in doing so, in playing together, we develop together. That makes a lot of sense to me. It's, in the end, how we develop, how animals develop, how we learn through play, and how we stop learning as we stop playing.
Mm-hmm. You locate those issues within the context of the current vision of the world, which is it has always been a complex world, but we didn't recognize it all the time. This has come to the fore more recently because of the kind of problems that we are facing that we are not able to tackle in traditional ways. So complexity is a sort of key word in your writing, and so is self-regulation.
It is.
Can you explain what you mean by complexity?
First of all, let me highlight what is not.
Good.
And because of the way we use in the everyday language the notion of complexity, we tend to synonymize that with complicacy, and complexity is beyond complicacy. If something is complicated, we can figure it out eventually. It's a matter of having the resources, time, etc., etc. Complexity engenders the idea of change, unknowability, and connections between things. So whatever we're dealing with, if it is complex, then it cannot be fully known. It cannot be fully explored. And it won't, not just because of a matter of scale, not just because it's big, not just because there are very many connections between very many parts, but it won't be fully knowable because it will be changing.
But we can know the different parts of the complex system, can't we?
Not necessarily.
But suppose we could, with the system, we can break it down in its components and know those components, are we then thinking about a complex system or something else?
Well, there's the other element, which is that complex systems change all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so even if we could take a look at parts, we would be dealing with interactions which would change over time, all the time. And they would change very often in unexpected ways, in ways that we wouldn't be able to predict somehow.
We wouldn't see the combination of interactions that take place between the parts. So even though we know all the parts, it's not like was assumed long ago that you know the location and velocity of any particle in the universe. You can predict what will happen. So it's something to do with predictability and uncertainty, right?
Exactly. And it's also the idea that whatever emerges from these interactions is not just about different behaviors. It's about completely unexpected forms of the system.
Mm-hmm.
And that adds an element to the complexity, the complex nature of these kind of things, the implications that these kind of systems can have. If I'm looking at the weather, I can think that there is a number of implications that the weather may have on us.
Yeah.
But if I think carefully, maybe there may be way many more implications that just by looking at my immediate environment I cannot be aware of, let alone predict.
Yeah.
And that's really the idea. It's a bit scary because I think it's counterintuitive for our culture, which is a culture which focuses very much on reducing whatever we can perceive to something that we can, in the first place, mentally manipulate, represent, and control, and then in the second place, practically
we tend
control.
to simplify.
Exactly. We tend to simplify.
There's a need to complexify.
There is a need to accept
complexity.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's not us complexifying things. It's more.
No, but so in our thinking, we have to think about the world as consisting of complex phenomena.
Exactly, and that's. I think that's a big challenge. That's a big cultural challenge, because that implies accepting that it's okay not to know. It's okay not to be able to control. It's okay to do our best, even knowing that we cannot change what needs to be changed by ourselves. And I think that is not really the mainstream thinking in our culture, at least the Western culture.
Yeah, in our culture, I think that's an important remark. Do you think it varies across cultures?
I think so.
Uh-huh.
I think so.
There are cultures that are more inclined to accept the fact that the world is complex and that do not tinker with the world in the way that we tend to do on the basis of how we culturally evolved in the West.
I think so. It's interesting because without having to explicitly address the notion of complexity, there are cultures like many Eastern cultures that are defined as more holistic. And I found that idea, that interpretation of holism, by the way, provided by Westerners also, that appreciation of holism in Eastern cultures is something very coherent with the notion of complexity. It's about recognition that we are parts of a whole which is constantly changing, and we can influence the whole as much as the whole influences us on a regular basis. But influencing is not controlling.
Yeah, the notion was coined by the West, but it was already present in the East.
Exactly.
And they didn't need a word for it because this was their world.
Their way of life.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That's quite an interesting distinction, actually. Talk about it. In your chapter, in the title of your chapter, the main title of your chapter, you use the term chaotic agency.
Yes.
Many readers will be unfamiliar with the term.
Yes.
I think it requires some explanation on your part.
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually the product of a deliberate search for a term, because the idea underpinning that is something that we've been working on for a long time with the people I've been working with in the first place, my wife Jimena, and it stemmed from wondering what is needed to deal with complexity, and almost an immediate awareness that whatever is needed could not be limited to a set of skills or to a set of knowledge, that there was this need for an interplay between skills, knowledge, and feelings somehow. So three spheres, affection, cognition, and behavior, should really play together in order to recognize that we're part of complex wholes in the first place, and then try to influence these wholes. And for some time, I've been thinking about what is this, what are we talking about, and trying to find words in the dictionary that would capture this idea, failing miserably and consistently, because there is no single word. And at some point, I started wondering about what the point of that search was. Well, what do we want to tell to people somehow? And the first thing that struck me was that this interplay between affect, cognition, and behavior was necessary in order to develop agency somehow, because that's the important thing. It's not how much we know about the world, but what we can do, exactly, what we can do in the world. At all levels, practical activity, intellectual activity, but really try to understand in order to influence in a positive way. And thinking about us in relation to the world, the environment, and the others. And so agency emerged as an important idea to explore, to investigate, and to promote somehow. But then there was agency in itself is nothing new. A lot has been written about that. So there was the idea of complexity, and what are we talking about? And it was not about really trying to engage people with the notion of complexity. Again, the importance of agency highlighted the fact that we really badly wanted people to think about complexity in order to influence complexity. And when what we pursue is some kind of order in the end. And complexity is a lot about seeming chaos. What we see, as soon as we embrace the idea that we cannot control, that it's something that has a life of its own somehow, and very often, because it's something problematic, that something is scary. That is something that, in the everyday life, people would tend very likely to label as chaotic, with a negative connotation. However, there is a way of promoting order out of chaos. And it's about understanding that what cannot be controlled also engenders opportunities, possibilities. And if we identify those possibilities and promote the surface of those possibilities, the emergence of those possibilities from that apparent disorder, that apparent chaos, then we can actually influence in a positive way that system. So we are agent promoting the emergence of order from chaos, hence the chaotic agency.
We can influence it, but we can't control it.
Exactly, we can influence it, and it's a continuous process.
Yeah.
It's a mindset shift from the idea of having to solve problems to the idea of having to define continuously and manage problematic situations.
Interact with problems.
Exactly, exactly, and it's an ongoing process, and it's a major cultural challenge.
We have, of course, been doing it all along, ever since humanity emerged, but we were never conscious of what precisely we did. So
I agree.
This is something that has come to our understanding quite a bit more recently, perhaps the last couple of decades.
Yes, I would agree.
You mentioned Jimena, your wife. She's a co-author with your chapter, and you collaborate.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
In not only on that chapter, but in general.
Yes, in general. Yes, and we're still married.
which is sort of exceptional in these modern times. Yeah, but it does happen. But interesting is your share profession, your share interests, and perhaps the fact that you're still married might have something to do with the fact that you have that shared interest.
Indeed, and I think it's more importantly a shared interest and concern for what we think is important in life. So it's not just about an intellectual interest. So it's really about things in the everyday's world that matter to us, and that will make us wonder, what can we do to improve? What can we do to help somehow? How can we contribute? Passion. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. That's, I think, the most important thing somehow. That is somehow what drives our work and continuous wondering about what can be done, what can be done.
Why is what you write about particularly important at the current juncture in time?
Because
we see it emerge now.
Yes.
And that may be in itself a co-evolutionary feature of the way our mind works. We thought we didn't need that kind of thinking earlier. We were interacting with the world in a different way. The world has changed, and our way of thinking about the world and interacting with the world is changing.
No, it has changed.
Yeah.
No, it's not just changing, and I think it's changed to a point.
We've not yet reached the end of it.
No. And I think it's just the beginning, and I'm concerned that we're not fully aware how much it has changed. I mean, if you turn the TV on, then you see many things that probably 5 years ago would have been unforeseeable, but not unforeseeable for cultural reasons. People wouldn't have said, yes, we can get to this point. Yes, this could happen. People wouldn't have even wondered about what if this happened, because it's scary things. It's really things that demonstrate at a political level, at an environmental level, at an economical level. It's things that demonstrate that the world is somehow uncontrollable, and that even human behavior goes beyond logics.
Yeah.
Even those who are in important decision-making position act in ways that apparently go against their own interest, let alone the interest of the people that they represent and they should look after.
Would it be justified to say that the fact that we ran into those problems that we are facing now, in terms of climate change, for instance, that is a consequence of the fact that we were not sufficiently aware of what it means to interact with a complex system?
Yes, I think there is a strong point there, which is not just being aware of what's happening, but it's more about getting used to investigate and become aware of the implications of whatever is happening, and look beyond our proximity. Unfortunately, I think that we tend to do that. We tend to look at our neighborhood, right, in a way, and we think that whatever is happening is going to affect our neighborhood. And to an extent, we've lost the ability, I believe, to look beyond our neighborhood and to really wonder what's going to happen. And to wonder not just because it's good to think about others, it's good to think about remote contexts, but also because whatever happens elsewhere is going to return somehow and affect us in return. So that awareness also that this is all connected and things are not on TV. Whatever I see on TV is going to knock at my door. And I think that that's the big change that we've seen in the last decades, that global warfare is not something that you see on the BBC or CNN or whatever, and it's happening in a remote place. You're going to see the same people knocking at your door, and we've seen that happening in France, for example, right? And so on and so forth. That whatever happened to the economy of a country is not something that will affect the numbers of that country.
Yeah.
It will affect your numbers as well. Education, the same. Trends that you see somewhere will affect whatever your children are going to learn in your own country. And so realizing that is an important thing to do, to have that agency that is required to say, what can I do in this context? I cannot control it. What is my contribution? And then next, what is our contribution? Looking at your neighbors. What can we do together?
So in our past way of thinking of our being in the world, we would usually just be dealing with a portion of reality. Like say we need to, or we think we need to generate electricity.
Yes.
Well, how do we do that? We happen to have coal, and we construct coal-fired generating facilities to do that for us. But we don't think that there are other consequences that might influence the complex system. And when we see them occur, we think, okay, we are going to fix that problem in some way. So we come up with a solution to the problem that has been generated by attending to the first issue, which again creates further problems. So it's a accumulation of a chain of actions that we are thinking of, and the unpredictability was not in our mind. It now is emerging, hopefully, but for many people it's still difficult to accept that.
Very many. And also because accepting that means, in a way, accepting that maybe now we have to generate another problem to tackle this one. But we have to be aware of that. So this is not about idealistic thinking that, there is a way of not generating any other problem. No, there isn't. I don't believe so, at least. But there's a way of managing, containing, compensating continuously. And so equilibrium is not... It's about a dynamic equilibrium. It's not the kind of equilibrium that I believe we should achieve. It's not about stopping everything, freezing everything, and so there's going to be no problem. That would be a global death somehow, right? And that's not the point. I think that animals have a lot to teach to us as to how to understand complexity, live with complexity, and live through and thanks to complexity and unpredictability. We were having a chat yesterday, and I told you that I learned a lot about complexity from trouts. Right? Yeah. And one very good example of a complex system are streams, rivers, and trout live in rivers, right? And they need to feed on insects that the river current carries. And if you look at a river, normally you would see patterns of some areas of high turbulence, and in between you would see very tranquil and calm pools, and that depends obviously on the shape and the materials and the depth of the riverbed, right? And it's not something that you can control. Animals living there cannot say, okay, I'm going to change the river, right? The best that they can say is, let me figure out where I should be in order to get what I need.
You accept the complexity.
Exactly, right? And what happens with trouts, the wild trouts, what they do basically is they live where we wouldn't live. They don't live in the calm, tranquil pool and say, okay, so something is going to be, it's comfortable and we're going to get food here. No, they live right at the edge between the high turbulence, which would be unsustainable, and the calm. So they live in a situation in which they have to put a lot of effort in the fact that they want to stay in a position there. But then that area also happens to be an area in which food converges. That is the edge of chaos. In the high turbulence, fish wouldn't be able to live. In the pool, there is the dispersion of food. In the transition, what happens is that you have turbulence but that's just low enough to allow fish to stay there. And the benefit of that is that food is concentrated in very shallow water, so it's easier to catch.
Mm-hmm.
And so somehow these beautiful creatures understood, had the intelligence to understand that if they stayed there, they could keep their position, they would be exposed to more food opportunities, and the effort that they had to put in staying there, which is not a minor effort, would still be acceptable, because they would burn less energy than the energy that they would get from feeding and from more abundant opportunities to feed. So they actually understood that they have to stay in a position which is not comfortable, but which is actually ideal to preserve their existence.
Mm-hmm.
And they spread also, because it's not one single position. Because of the irregularity, you have small pools, you have rocks, etc. And so depending on the size of the fish, they naturally spread and they don't overlap.
They do not rationalize about it, but we do, of course.
We do.
So the nature of understanding in the trout is different from our way of understanding. But it's a beautiful metaphor. It's saying for life as we live it, with humans live it, in being aware of our position at the edge of chaos.
Absolutely. And then that makes you think about what we define as intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you ask a fisherman, they would say they're very intelligent creatures. They figured all these kind of things out.
Yeah.
And how did they realize? Did anyone explain to them? They detected patterns. They observed, and that's another important thing. They observed what was happening in their surroundings, and time and again observe, detect patterns, and then somehow realize that that's a good thing to do, and do it. If it changes, they change.
Yeah.
If the depth increases, you won't find them in the same place. You will see that they adopt different patterns of behavior. And if you observe those patterns, you will see a rationality in that as well. And that's somehow what I believe we should do. Go back to that simplicity, which lies in the ability to observe, wonder about the implications of whatever we are observing, make a guess, make a hypothesis based on what I've seen. I think this would be good. And then try and see what happens, and do that continuously.
And seeing the full complexity of what you're observing.
Exactly. You get used to that.
Yeah.
It becomes a habit.
Yesterday also we talked about activity theory.
Yes.
And I think I'd like to repeat that in our discussion.
Absolutely.
Here in front of the camera.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. So we're talking about one of the pillars of the former Soviet psychology, and it's basically a system of ideas which don't have much new compared to the Western pillars of psychology. But what I found is really different, is the ability to integrate everything together in one single system. And the core idea is basically that whatever is our psyche develops forms through activity. It feeds activity, and it's fed by activity. So there is no way we can separate what is our practical activity from our psychological activity. And when we talk about psychological activity, again, this integral perspective holds that there is no way to separate what is the rational aspect from what is the affective aspect of our psychological activity. So you have unity between these three aspects: practical activity, rational activity, and affective activity, which in the end they call unity between conscience and behavior somehow.
That sounds like the quote that we started with from Johann Huizinga, who mentioned it, and he lived at the beginning of the 20th century, the later part of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. He died in 1945. But he was a historian and a cultural theorist. So that's a different discipline than the disciplines that have influenced us very much in the way in Western society, at least, how we developed, industrialized, and started thinking about the world. I wish people had more seriously attended to his writings.
And that's an interesting thing, because actually activity theory is born, or was born, with a strong focus on the importance of society and culture on the development of the human mind. And so what you said, Huizinga discipline was a different discipline, is probably one of the problems that we should remove.
Exactly.
Forget about disciplines.
That's
And as soon as we start thinking differently, avoid compartmentalizing things, then these similarities, we will take them not as incidents, but as just, the result of investigating reality and from different perspectives, but yet complementary perspectives, and then ending up to similar discoveries, similar conclusions, which may be very well a flag that some interesting patterns has been found, and we figured out something that would be worth trying, experimenting, doing, and then see what happens. That is really the idea. In fact, interestingly, the activity theorists, many were working, we're talking about psychologists like Vygotsky, Leontiev, etc. Many were working based on what was the Marxist philosophy, and based on the need to interpret a social system and come up with psychological models that would not only explain but also justify what could be good about that social system and might not be good. So you can argue that in that case, we're talking about the theory which has been developed, not thinking about a strict focus on the psychological phenomena, but starting from the social dimension.
Perhaps in conclusion, and I think you mentioned it in passing, the education system or systems that we have, to what extent do they prepare us appropriately for that kind of seeing ourselves functioning in the world?
Obviously, the chapter we wrote is dominantly focused on higher education. And in that particular case, I think that, as somehow reflected by the chapter, I think that the importance of contextualized design is something which is highly overlooked in higher education. And by contextualized design, I mean the importance of learning how to analyze systems and design systems for a purpose, being that purpose something that reflects real world problems. So I think there is too much, first of all, there is too little emphasis on design skills in general. So I'm not talking just about artistic skills, but I'm talking about systems design. And secondly, there is a lack of contextualization. Whatever is done is very often, in my experience at least, is very often driven by the pursuit of skills in abstract and the fulfillment of some learning outcomes in abstract. And there is very little connection with real world contexts somehow, and that's a big problem. That's a big problem in higher education, because we would expect decision makers, a good proportion of decision makers, and as much as experts, specialists, to come from that environment. So how can we expect that if there is a disconnection from the real world? Decision making about what? Expertise about what, if it's something abstract and decontextualized.
So people don't grow up in the current education systems being aware of the meaning of the skills and attitudes and whatever they develop
No.
in terms of their preferred application in the world. And they end up having those skills, and they can use them anyway. They can use them to destruct, they can use them to construct.
Exactly, like all tools somehow.
Yes. Exactly.
We have to realize that.
To take a hammer.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So, and I think in that sense, the particular case of higher education, I think there should be a big question about what the main aim of higher education should be. And, to somehow put it in a nutshell, I think we should wonder whether the main aim should be about promoting purpose versus providing a commodity, because to me knowledge and skills are nowadays commodities. I can access the opportunity to develop that through higher education, but there are also many other possibilities to access that.
You're obviously working in a higher education context, but shouldn't that start actually much earlier in kindergarten, or even before that in the family environment?
Yes.
The way we, as an infant, we grow up in that environment and then go through the various phases of the education system.
Yes, and that's what I meant when I said at the beginning that the situation that I see is very variable. It's not just because of some environments and some countries, but it's also because of the stage of education that we're talking about. Definitely, it starts with family. And interestingly, we mentioned activity theory, but the activity theory is one of those frameworks that say that this is about human development through activity. It's not about adult development or teenager development, etc. So it's a process that works with that kind of integrative schema, and it works ever since you're born. Mm-hmm. So in the first place, your family is going to be your first social community that will influence somehow your thinking. But not just rational thinking, sensibilities. Yeah. So what you're sensible to. You can imagine that it might be difficult, to educate, so to speak, a 1-year-old or 2-year-old about such complex things. And what can you do as a
most of us do it. Anyway.
Most of us do it. But you see that just the fact that you share beauty with them, that you take them to something beautiful, you allow them to admire, and you transfer admiration for something beautiful, harmonious. That is to me an important step of this education. So you make
sure that their activity is taken seriously within the family environment.
Exactly.
It is seen, it's being talked about, it's being felt about.
Exactly. Exactly. Children, in my experience, they wonder naturally. Mm-hmm. It's part of human nature.
Yeah.
And so by wondering with them about things, well, that's, for instance, an important step, because you reinforce the fact that wondering, and we talked about the importance of exploring implications, and it starts with that natural wondering.
It's important that child never dies in us.
Exactly, and we go back to the importance of play. Yeah. It's a bit of a playfulness that we need to preserve somehow. And then formal educational environments should somehow. So as far as family goes, the importance of these matters doesn't mean that families should feel overburdened with heaven knows what kind of responsibility, but no, it's really about those basic things and realize how important they are and promote them.
Yeah.
And the same should continue through education, and then formal education, I mean. And I've seen how this goes worse and worse as it progresses, how education for children is very often magnificent. Mm-hmm. And then you get to the stage where children become adults and they are being educated as adults with allegedly the purpose of making them active and positive agents of modern society. And when you compare what they were learning versus what they are learning, it's shocking. It's really like realizing that there are the outcome is very often limiting rather than empowering.
You would hope that none of them would become a Minister of Education.
No, but they will. One
Carlo,
of them will.
Thank you very much for that
Thank
conversation. You must avoid it.
We've already done it, so it's too
Thank you.
late. Thank you, Jan.
Thanks for your
Thank
chapter
you.
also.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.